Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a little talk about standards. Standards of quality in terms of orchestral performance and standards of criticism as a result of those standards of quality in orchestral performance. This was brought home to me by the fact that I gave a positive review to the Vasily Petrenko's Mahler Third on Harmonia Mundi, but within certain qualifying parameters. And other critics who I respect very much, including my colleague Christophe Huss at Le Devoir in Montreal, trashed it, apparently. Probably for many of the reasons I, enjoyed it. But the bottom line is, I pointed out in that review that it was a performance that might be just about as good as we have any right to expect given circumstances today. There could be playing that might be a little bit better, but the real issue is this was a one-off live performance, which went really, really well. The performance was exciting. The interpretation, I thought, was very persuasive, but there were issues of execution, and particularly given the fact that the thing was recorded in Royal Albert Hall, issues of sonics and engineering. And it seems to me, I did a video a little while back about the differences between the golden age of recording in the 50s and 60s when stereo first popped up and whatnot, and what we get now. And I pointed out that one of the differences that made those recordings so great is that the artists themselves knew that they were making recordings for posterity, and cared more and worked harder and had engineers whose job was more than just to set up the microphones and hope. It was to sit down with the artists and listen to playbacks and say, no, that didn't go. I'll go out and do it again, do it better, do this. That's all gone. What we have now in orchestral recording, by and large, is simply a series of live performances, and we're stuck with whatever happens on the day. But the question is, the deeper question is, how should we rate those recordings when we have these classic recordings of the golden age ready to hand for comparison purposes? It could be that these are the best that we're going to get. And if they're the best that we're going to get, shouldn't we just say that and revise our grading system, grading on a curve, let the person who does the best for what we can expect today get the best review. Everything fiber in my body rebels against that notion because, of course, we know what those great recordings sounded like, and standards of quality, if not entirely objective, ought to be at least agreed upon. And what should be agreed upon is the level of excellence in question. But there is a deeper philosophical issue, which is what is the intention behind the making of a recording? And I don't mean from a technical point of view. I don't mean like, we talked about this, artists know they're going to make one recording in their whole lives and it's going to be forever, versus people who just, that's what I felt like on the day and you're stuck with it and tomorrow I made you differently. That's always been with us, that dichotomy. But the difference that I'm thinking of is that one of the things that made those old recordings so special, in addition to having the engineers and whatnot, is that they were made specifically for home listening. We talk about studio versus live recordings or concert hall recordings. None of those recordings were made in studios. They're made in concert halls. Sometimes the concert halls had fabulous acoustics, and if they didn't, you had to go someplace where you did get great acoustics. The Jesus Christus Kirche in Berlin, or the Walthamstow Town Hall in the UK. You went someplace where the sound was ideal. But ideal for what? Not ideal for an audience of concert goers. Ideal for an audience of home listeners. And that's a perfectly valid and legitimate way to experience music. And in a sense, it's better for home listening than going to a concert live, because you're going to get a very different sound. Most concert halls are not ideal if you're setting up microphones capturing a performance live if there's an audience. If there isn't an audience, the acoustic may be totally wrong, too swimmy, too large, too echoey, too whatever it is, and too dry if there is an audience. So those recordings were made with a certain ideal of orchestral sound as heard at home through a good sound system, not high-end crazy. There are recordings, of course, who, engineered by people who are high-end crazy specialists, and they make records designed for their high-end crazy systems with obscene dynamic range and, yes, Finster, thank you, and all kinds of other stuff like that. But the fact of the matter is, those records were designed for consumers to purchase and listen to at home and enjoy. And what they were supposed to give you was not concert hall realism specifically, but better than that. They were supposed to give you a level of detail and accuracy of balance that you could only achieve if you were in the best possible seat, in the best possible idealized concert hall. And of course, the way to approach that was, there are a million different ways to do it. You could do it through millions of microphones. You could do it through just 2 microphones or 1 microphone. I mean, there are all kinds of philosophies and things, but the approach was similar. The concept was similar, that this was a product to be listened to at home. Today, that's gone. It's absolutely gone. Nobody, when Vasily Petrenko was doing the Mahler Third with the, Royal Philharmonic at Albert Hall, thought we need to engineer and plan the performance around the fact that it's going to be heard at home by consumers. They just gave a live performance. I mean, someone who was recording it may have thought, okay, this doesn't sound good, that doesn't sound good. But I really, really doubt they had a philosophy of what ideal home listening should sound like, as the major labels and the best independent labels did in the 50s and 60s and 70s. They had a philosophy of sound. They had ideal acoustic spaces in which to make their recordings. They had engineers who subscribed to that philosophy. They had a house sound. Some people hated it, some people liked it, but they had it. People talked about, for example, the Decca piano sound. They had a sound for that instrument. They had a place where they thought it sounded best. I really, really strongly doubt that in today's marketplace, any of these labels care about that anymore. They don't even think of the home consumer. I mean, they may think vaguely that they have to sell the damn thing. They're not doing much to do that either. So then the question is this. Given the fact that the idea of creating a product for home listening is no longer a priority or no longer even a possibility, what should we expect as listeners and as critics? Do we relax our standards and say, okay, this is really a very, very good performance, because I think the Petrenko Mahler Third was a very good performance, aside from lousy singing and a few other things, but basically a good performance, an interesting performance, an exciting live event that we can imaginatively believe we might have attended, maybe, kind of? Or do we insist dogmatically and strictly on standards that are not going to exist? You see, you want to have standards. You got to have standards. You have to have standards of excellence that are the result of careful comparative listening. That's how you achieve standards. You don't just pluck them out of thin air. They're based on practical listening experience of the best that's available. And so that's how you know what your standards are. But if we insist on that, then we're going to hate everything that shows up nowadays, practically. Yes, there will be the occasional miracle, but basically you're going to dislike everything for reasons that may or may not be directly relatable to the interpretation happening, in front of you. It's going to detract from it. You're going to become bitter and jaded and miserable. I don't want to do that. But on the other hand, I really want to uphold those standards because they exist. and because we have a right to expect them before we spend our money, and because they're there. There's no excuse not to try to achieve those standards, and there's no excuse not to employ the approach that worked best to achieve those standards. Unless, of course, the only issue is money, which is really what it always is, isn't it? When it comes down to dollars and cents. So I'm just throwing this out there. I don't have an answer. I really don't have an answer. But this recording, particularly this Mahler third, really raised the question. It really did, because I really enjoyed the performance. I did, while acknowledging that it does not rise to the level of excellence as an all-around product for home listening to Mahler's Third Symphony that some of the greatest recordings of the past achieved, and achieved routinely, because the whole system was different. Like I said, I don't have an exact answer for that. It's something I'm wrestling with, and probably will have to continue to wrestle with as long as I exist. And we have to decide these things on a case-by-case basis. And so do you. You have to do it as well. My overarching concern in this whole idea is that we don't become sour and embittered and jaded and just say, oh, it's live, it's this, it's recent, it must suck. You know, you can't prejudge things that way. We always have to keep on listening, keep an open mind, take everything on a case-by-case basis, and while at the same time upholding the highest and best standards in a comparative market where people have choice. And they can either get the best or they can get the worst. I get some criticism every so often from people who say, you only like old recordings, you're just an old fart, and you only like dead people, and you don't give any attention to like living people. Personally, I don't think the fact that you're alive matters at all. I really don't. I don't think there should be any preference given to living artists just because they're alive. That has nothing to do with music. That's just an organic piece of trivia as far as I'm concerned. But on the other hand, you can't live in the past. You just can't. You've got to have, hope for the future and belief in the future. And unless the evidence is that there's no point in having any hope or belief, in which case there's no point in doing any of this. It's just too nihilistic. I'm not that kind of a person. And I tend to be optimistic. I hear wonderful things all the time. So I know that it's out there. The question is, can today's classical music industry capture those things in the best way to present them to us? And so far, it's not doing such a hot job, in my view. It could be doing better. It may figure out how to do it better. I'm eternally hopeful. But that's where it stands. And there will be times when I think it's worth it to compromise some standards, the highest and best standards, perhaps, in favor of something which is definitely fresh and new and worth hearing, even though it may not be the best. And there are other times where I think you got to just put your foot down and say, I'm sorry, this isn't acceptable. As in, for example, that Malofiev piano recital and the Bach cello thing with what's her name. I mean, just horrid engineering, unacceptable engineering by any standard, rational standard. And there will be others where, it's okay. So we're going to have an ongoing discussion about this topic. There's no question that it's not going away, and we're going to have to wrestle with it. And I just wanted to throw it out there for you folk to consider, because there really are differences, and they have meaningful implications to our experience of music at home and our willingness to pay for it, which I think is a big deal. Don't have to feel bad about going to watch something free on YouTube and So Sound. But if you're going to be asked to pay a premium for physical product, I think you're entitled to a certain, level of excellence. I do. And I probably always will. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.